Have you ever felt like you were running from something, only to find it in the most unexpected place? This is the story of Sister Clara, a woman bound by vows, walking a path she thought was chosen for her. Her life in the convent was meant to be her peace, her purpose. But deep down, there was always something missing, something she couldn't escape. One fateful evening, as she walked through the countryside, a storm came out of nowhere. The rain fell in torrents, drenching her to the bone. Clara sought shelter in a secluded barn, hoping for just a moment of respite. But what she found inside wasn't just safety from the storm. In that barn, Clara encountered Ethan, a man whose presence stirred something inside her she thought had long been buried. As the night wore on, Clara realized the storm wasn't just the rain. It was a force that forced her to confront the fears and desires she had suppressed for so long. What if the life she had chosen wasn't the life she was meant to lead? Stay with me as we explore Clara's unexpected encounter in the barn, where one night would forever change her path. Would she continue running, or face the storm head-on? Sister Clara had always found solace in the peace of the countryside. As she walked along the winding, muddy path, the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds were the only sounds that filled the air. Her mind wandered freely, content in the serenity of the moment, with each step grounding her in the calm. The simplicity of nature was her refuge, a stark contrast to the bustling life she had left behind. For a while, she could forget everything, her vows, her doubts, and the quiet longing in her heart. But that calm, that peace, was shattered in an instant. Without any warning, the sky above her darkened, a heavy blanket of clouds rolling in faster than she could have imagined. The first raindrops were gentle, almost welcoming. But within moments, they turned into a torrential downpour, the kind that soaks you to the bone. Clara's cloak, meant to shield her from the elements, was no match for the fierce storm. She could feel the cold seeping through her wet clothes, her body growing heavier with every drop that hit her. Every step along the muddy path felt more and more like a struggle. The weight of the rain pulled at her, slowing her down, as if the earth itself was resisting her movement. The familiar countryside, once so peaceful, now seemed oppressive, as though the storm had swallowed it whole. Her breath quickened, and panic began to set in. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of her, the world around her obscured by the downpour. Just as she thought she couldn't go on, as her legs grew tired and the weight of the rain felt unbearable, Clara spotted something through the storm. A barn. It was barely visible through the sheets of rain, but it was there, a potential refuge. Her heart raced with a renewed sense of hope. Without thinking, she pushed forward, her soaked feet slipping in the mud as she hurried toward it, praying for shelter from the unforgiving storm. Each step toward the barn felt like a small victory against the elements. Her thoughts focused solely on the promise of warmth and dry ground, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that, perhaps, she wasn't as alone in the world as she had once thought. She reached the barn, breathless and drenched, but relieved to be out of the storm's grip. Little did she know, this barn would become the place where her life would take an unexpected turn, and the storm outside would be nothing compared to the storm brewing inside her heart. Inside the barn, Clara shook off the rain, letting the droplets fall to the ground around her. The musty scent of hay filled the air, mixing with the earthy smell of damp wood and the faint hint of animal warmth. It wasn't much, just a small, dimly lit space, but it was a refuge. The storm outside pounded against the roof, but in here, it was dry, and for that, Clara felt a momentary sense of relief. The barn was bare, save for tools stacked along one wall and piles of hay in the far corner. The silence inside, broken only by the steady rhythm of the rain, seemed almost peaceful compared to the chaos of the storm outside. Clara leaned against the rough wall, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath and calm her racing heart. She had been so lost in the storm, so caught in the moment, that she hadn't expected to find anyone else here. Then, suddenly, a voice cut through the stillness. "Who's there?" Clara froze, her hand instinctively gripping her wet cloak, and her heart skipped a beat. She turned slowly, her mind racing. By the entrance stood a man, tall, with broad shoulders, his wet shirt clinging to his body, and his muddy boots telling the story of a long, hard day. He looked as if he had been out in the storm for hours. His face was rugged, weathered, but his eyes were soft. There was a quiet curiosity in them, mixed with a cautiousness that made Clara's pulse quicken. I'm sorry, Clara stammered, trying to steady her nerves. I was caught in the rain and needed shelter. The man studied her for a moment, his gaze steady, before nodding slowly. You're welcome to stay. Not many people come this way. He took a few steps toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. Clara noticed the calluses on his hands, worn from years of hard work. There was something about him that made her feel oddly safe, as if she had stumbled upon a refuge not just from the storm, but from something deeper. I'm Ethan, he said, his voice low but warm, like the crackle of a fire on a cold night. Clara, she replied softly, the words feeling almost foreign on her tongue. They stood there for a moment, the tension of the storm still heavy in the air between them. Neither spoke, but in that silence, Clara couldn't help but notice how the quiet seemed to settle around Ethan, as though the storm outside had no place here. Ethan motioned toward a small pile of firewood stacked neatly in the corner of the barn. If you want, I can start a fire. You look like you could use some warmth, he offered, his voice low and steady. Clara hesitated for a moment, glancing at the firewood, then back at him. There was something about him, something both reassuring and unsettling. But the cold that had seeped into her bones was overwhelming, and the thought of the warmth from the fire seemed too tempting to resist. Thank you, she finally said, her voice soft, almost reluctant. Ethan moved to the pile, his hands steady as he began to work, gathering logs and placing them carefully in a small pit near the center of the barn. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye, her gaze drawn to his movements. There was something about the way he moved, purposeful, controlled, and confident. His broad shoulders and muscular arms flexed with every adjustment to the wood. There was an ease to him, a quiet strength that stirred something inside her. The air between them seemed to hum with unspoken words, a tension neither of them knew how to address. As Ethan struck the match and the flames flickered to life, the warmth spread through the barn, pushing back the chill that clung to Clara's body. She sat near the fire, her hands held out to its heat, the flickering light casting shadows across her face. The storm outside raged on, but in this small barn, she felt strangely sheltered. After a long silence, Ethan broke it, his voice gentle but probing. He glanced at her briefly before asking, So, what brings a nun to this part of the country? Clara's breath caught in her throat. The question was so direct, so personal. She hadn't expected him to ask about her past, not so soon, not in this strange place. She blinked, unsure of how to respond, the weight of her vows pressing down on her chest. I needed time away to think, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but he didn't press her further. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the fire, his expression shifting as he stared into the flames, lost in his own thoughts. Clara found herself glancing at him more often than she intended. There was a magnetic pull to him, something in the way he sat, so grounded, so unburdened by the world. His jawline was sharp, the flex of his muscles as he adjusted the firewood seemed effortless. Clara's heart fluttered in her chest, a strange warmth blooming beneath her ribs. She quickly looked away, ashamed of the sudden rush of emotions she couldn't explain. The fire crackled, and the silence stretched on, thick with the unspoken. Neither of them seemed willing or ready to break it. The silence grew heavier between them as the rain continued to pour outside, its rhythm against the barn roof almost comforting, but still thick with the weight of unspoken words. Clara couldn't stop herself from wondering about Ethan, his life, his story. Who was he really? This man who had offered her shelter, his life seemingly untouched by the world outside. She could sense the depth in his eyes, the quiet sadness that lingered beneath his rugged exterior. Just when the thought crossed her mind, Ethan spoke again, his voice cutting through the stillness. You're not like other nuns, are you? Clara's head snapped up, her heart skipping a beat at his words. She frowned, unsure of how to react. What do you mean? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though a nervous tremor betrayed her. Ethan's gaze flickered briefly to her before returning to the fire. You seem different, like you don't quite belong in those robes, he said, his tone casual, but there was an edge of curiosity beneath it. His words struck Clara like a sudden gust of wind. She felt the heat of the fire warming her cheeks, but the words, his words, were like an ice-cold shock to her system. Do I belong here? She stared at the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker in the darkness. Was he right? She had chosen the convent for peace, for purpose, but lately, it felt like she was running from something. Something deep inside her, something she couldn't ignore anymore. From herself. The question lingered, unspoken, filling the space between them. Clara looked away from the flames, her eyes tracing the outline of the barn, her thoughts swirling in a storm of their own. She had given up so much to join the convent. Her family, her dreams, her desires, all left behind in search of something that she thought would bring peace. But was that what she had really been searching for? Or was she hiding from a life she couldn't have, a life she had buried beneath the vows she'd made? How would you know where I belong? Clara asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to keep the edge of frustration from creeping in, but it was impossible. The question seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. Ethan shrugged, not looking at her. Just a guess. Ethan's quiet presence was a contrast to her inner turmoil. There was no judgment in his gaze, no pity, just a simple acknowledgement of the human struggle to find meaning, to find peace. For a brief moment, Clara considered telling him everything, the doubts, the fears, the life she had left behind. But the words felt too heavy, too difficult to voice. Instead, she remained silent, her fingers curling slightly around the edges of her cloak. The fire crackled, and the rain outside intensified, the storm growing louder. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, thudding in her ears, as the storm within her mirrored the one outside. The rain slowed to a drizzle, but the tension in the barn remained thick, hanging in the air like an unsaid truth. Clara glanced toward the door, then back at Ethan. For a fleeting moment, she considered leaving, returning to the convent, to the life she knew. But something unspoken, kept her rooted to the spot. Ethan stood up, breaking the silence. You should eat something. I have bread and soup inside. Clara hesitated, unsure. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. You're already here, he said with a faint smile. Might as well make use of it. She followed him into the small farmhouse, a cozy, simple space with a wooden table at the center and mismatched chairs surrounding it. Ethan handed her a towel to dry off while he heated soup on the stove. Clara couldn't help but notice how bare the house felt. No decorations, no personal touches. It was clear that Ethan had lived alone for a long time. As they ate, Clara couldn't shake the curiosity. Do you live here alone? She asked, breaking the silence. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. For years now, ever since. His voice trailed off, and he stared into his bowl, lost in thought. Ever since what? Clara asked softly. My wife passed away. 5 years ago. Clara's heart sank. I'm so sorry. It's fine, Ethan replied, though his tone held a quiet sadness. Life moves on, right? His words hit Clara deeply. She couldn't help but ask, do you ever feel stuck? Like no matter what you do, you can't escape the past. Ethan looked at her, his eyes sharp. Why do you ask? Clara hesitated, then spoke, her voice vulnerable. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. Joining the convent was supposed to bring me peace, but it feels like I'm running from something instead of finding answers. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. Sounds like we're not so different after all. Clara met his eyes. What do you mean? I spent years blaming myself for my wife's death, he said quietly, thinking if I'd done things differently, maybe she'd still be here. But now, I realize life doesn't give second chances. All we can do is move forward. Clara nodded slowly, his words echoing in her mind. Perhaps, like him, she, too, had been running from her own regrets, her own choices. Clara walked back inside, her footsteps hesitant as the door creaked closed behind her. Ethan was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table, his gaze fixed on the glass of whiskey in front of him. The weight of the moment pressed on her. She had almost left, but something had pulled her back. I couldn't leave, Clara admitted softly, her voice shaking with the vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Ethan looked up, his expression softening. A faint smile tugged at his lips. It's okay to be scared, he said gently. But don't let fear stop you from living. For a moment, the words lingered between them, and without thinking, Clara crossed the room, standing beside him. Slowly, she reached out, and their hands intertwined. The storm outside had calmed, the rain now a mere drizzle against the windows. Neither of them spoke, but in that silence, Clara felt something shift deep within her. She didn't know what the future held, or what choices she'd have to make, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. And maybe, just maybe, the storm wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning.